How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 63rd video on the channel, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I've recently finished translating an essay by the Danish linguist and semiotician Louis Hjelmslev, titled The Stratification of Language, which I would love to cover soon. However, currently, I'm waiting on permission from the Linguistic Circle of Copenhagen to share it with you all. In the meanwhile, I thought it might be interesting to try to give a rough rundown of Hjelmslev's theory of glossematics, which, although infamously impenetrable, was massively influential for Guattari's work. This particular video is mainly structured around Una Canger's dissertation, Analysis and Outline of Mam, a Mayan Language. But if y'all are interested, I could maybe do a series of videos with this style, examining Hjelmslev's Résumé of a theory of language, to explore glossematics more deeply. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing to understand about glossematics is that it sees languages, or more accurately semiotics, as structures usually made up of two planes, that of content and that of expression. As you can see in this diagram, the first is marked with Greek letters, and the second by Latin ones, although what exactly that V in brackets means is something we'll look at later. For now, what is important is that every sentence, clause, word, or what have you is a sign, made up of a content that roughly corresponds to meaning, and an expression that can take all sorts of shapes, like speaking, writing, and so on and so on. When it comes down to it, Hjelmslev is insistent on the fact that a content is only the content of an expression, and vice versa. The two planes that make up signs are only defined in relation to each other. As Guattari says in the Anti-Oedipus papers, there's no reason why they couldn't be called A and B instead. Rather than having any formal meaning, the names associated with them are just there for convenience and convention's sake. As a note on terminology, it's often better to say sign function rather than sign, since, in glossematics, the focus is on the connection or contraction itself. The two planes contract a function that can be described as interdependence, since each relies on the other. It is this that is represented by the double-sided arrow here. On the top, we find the expression, when he saw me, he left the garden, written phonetically, albeit not in my dialect. On the bottom, we find the content tied to it. The reason why I've split this sentence into clauses is to illustrate another type of relationship, determination, marked with this fancy arrow. The intonation of my voice, saying, when he saw me, rises, whilst it falls when I say, he left the garden. I say that the former determines the latter because it requires what follows, but the same can't be said for the inverse. Likewise, the content of a clause, when he saw me, determines he left the garden, since the when makes it so more context is required. The point of this demonstration is to show that, whilst mutually interdependent, content and expression still have their own differing internal dynamics. A big part of this is due to what Hjelmslev calls Figurae. Sign functions don't just come out of nowhere. Instead, they are built on the basis of non-signifying elements, which exist independently for each plane. As an example, take the sign function of am. Alongside the expression of a written word itself, you find content in the combination of to be, indicative, present, first person, and singular. On the first plane, it is possible to break it down into the figura A and the figura M. Likewise, on the plane of content, those 5 elements are all figurae when separated. Apart, they don't signify anything. You don't have a function between A and the first person singular in English after all. Instead, this sign only contracts a combination of elements from both planes. It's important to note at this point that figurae are not quite actual sounds, letters, or meanings. Instead, they're bits and pieces of what in glossematics is called form, which can only be described by its interrelationships. To take a bit of a step back, in his Prolegomena to a theory of language, Hjelmslev explains that it all starts with a non-linguistic amorphous mass, known as purport. To take an example from the content plane, this might be a color spectrum, where everything runs into everything else. As is, it's incomprehensible. It needs some organization, which appears as that form. This is said to be cast onto the purport like the shadow of a net. In the process, it generates semiotic substance, actually intelligible bits of expression and content. This process is called manifestation. As can be seen in the diagram, how form cuts up the purport is arbitrary. The forms of a Welsh word glass contain elements of English's green and blue. Those actual letters, sounds, and meanings are the substances that are said to manifest them. As you can see at the bottom, they determine forms. By their very nature, substance needs something to organize it. Otherwise, there is just purport. Forms, on the other hand, don't need to be made apparent. With this in mind, we can get into a couple of equations. An uppercase lambda is used to represent substance, whilst an uppercase v represents the phrase to form in manifestation. As you can see at the top, form doesn't need to have anything next to it when symbolized. Below, we can see how the same form can be selected by multiple different substances. Hello can have both a phonic existence, like when I say it, or a written one, like shown in the diagram itself. However, the inverse isn't true. There's no such thing as a substance with multiple forms. Determination only goes one way. In the cases shown here, the form of P is manifested in the phonic substance pa, whilst a variant of N is manifested as nasality in French. As you may have noticed, the symbolic notation used in the last few diagrams had a marker for degrees included. In Glossematics, this is what is used to denote a stratum, which, as described in the stratification of language, can appear in 6 forms, and designates the whole set of whatever it includes. The first pair of strata are those of the planes of content and expression themselves. Going back to what we said at the beginning, they're marked with a V in parentheses to show that they aren't formed, instead being linked to purport. The second pair is that of content form and content substance, and the third is the same, just with expression. Alongside the relations of manifestation that connect the internal elements of the latter two pairs, there's something called denotation. This makes up the sign function and specifically links content form to expression form. At this point, it might be useful to go over functions in some more detail. We've already seen that denotation is an example of interdependence, that manifestation is an example of determination, but we've not really explored their formal definitions. To begin with, objects that are said to have function to each other are known as functives. These are divided into 2 main varieties: constants, which are required by the other functive in the function, and variables, which aren't. We can represent this in equations by writing C for constant and V for variable. Along with the double-sided arrow linked to interdependence and the fancy arrow linked to determination, there's a third type of function that is marked with a vertical line. Known as constellations, these involve 2 variables that are compatible with each other, but which aren't required by the other. Many things form constellations. Take the article a and the noun dog. They form a constellation insofar as dog can exist independently from a, and a can exist independently from dog. However, this is only one level of complexity when it comes to functions. With interdependencies, determinations, and constellations in mind, we can move on now to one of the most important distinctions in glossematic theory, that between syntagmatics, or processes, and paradigmatics, or systems. There are 2 ways to view any language. On the one hand, you can look at how elements occur with each other, like the letters D, O, and G in the word dog. On the other hand, you can look at how they alternate, like the T in bat versus the K in back. In the first case, you're looking at chains in a process, whereas in the second, the focus falls on paradigms in a system. When it comes to functions, there are different sets of vocabulary depending on what viewpoint you take on. Most of our examples from earlier were syntagmatic. Content and expression make up a solidarity, a and dog make up a combination, and substance and form make up a selection. Together, these 3 are described as relations and contrast paradigmatic correlations. For the vast majority of this video, we'll be focusing on processes, so these symbols are the most important. Regardless, some familiarity with paradigms would be good. As you can see here, interdependencies become complementarities, determinations become specifications, and constellations become autonomies. In the case of the first, vowels and consonants are complementary, since, in a system, they only exist in correlation with each other. Concerning specifications, definitions themselves are a perfect example. The term specification specifies determination, since it is ultimately based on it. Finally, rather paradoxically, the planes of content and expression are autonomous in the paradigmatic view. They can be separated in a paradigm, even if not in the chain. Returning now to denotation, this isn't the only kind of sign function out there. Technically, any function that contracts multiple different planes together is such. However, what I want to focus on now is something called connotation, which is very useful when it comes to comparing different languages. Before we get ahead of ourselves, though, it might be good to know the difference between variance and invariance first. Essentially, as the name suggests, variants are things that can be substituted for other elements in a paradigm without both planes changing. Invariants, on the other hand, are those that can't be substituted in this way. While C and H are invariant at the beginning of words, like in the case of cat and hat, the many different ways of saying each one counts as variants. This distinction is quite valuable when it comes to understanding connotation. Take the example of the English phrase I am, placed next to the Afrikaans phrase ek is. These mean the same thing, being variants, but the difference in language hides this fact. In Glossematics, it's possible to say that English and Afrikaans play the role of connotators, having functioned to the solidarity of content and expression. It is only by stripping these connotators away that it's possible to register I am and ek is as variants. To give another example, this time taken directly from Una Canger's dissertation, the words to swipe and to steal are variants. However, this is only clear once certain connotators have been taken out of a picture, like the division between formal and informal speech. When it comes down to it, just like there's a solidarity between content and expression, there's a solidarity between these connotators and denotation. In the Prolegomena, Hjelmslev explains that the latter always involves every single facet of a former, with things like language, dialect, style, and so on, being inseparable from that first kind of sign function. It's with this in mind that we can introduce a new type of semiotic, connotative ones. So far, we've only looked at so-called denotative semiotics, which have a fairly simple setup, a couple planes linked in solidarity, without much else going on. However, this isn't all there is. Connotative semiotics are defined as those that take another semiotic as their plane of content. As represented in this diagram, Afrikaans contracts a connotative semiotic with denotation, generating connotation as a sign function. When talking about languages in glossematics, you say that there is an arbitrary connection between a certain schema or set of internal form functions and a certain connotator. However, connotative semiotics aren't the only kind of complex semiotics there are. We also have what Hjelmslev calls metasemiotics, which are defined by having another semiotic as their plane of content. Again, it's worth mentioning that the names of the planes are arbitrary, and thus Hjelmslev stresses that there is no real operative value in calling one connotative and the other meta. It's just for the sake of convenience. With that said, metasemiotics are things like linguistics itself. Having taken a semiotic like a language as its content, it expresses that through its description. This expression often takes a form that is identical with its object semiotic or its content. In other words, you can describe a language in that language. However, of course, this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Ending this particular section, I would like to note that there are many other layers of complexity that can be applied here. For example, there are such things as semiologies, scientific semiotics, metasemiologies, and meta-scientific semiotics. I've just decided to brush over them for the sake of time. Glossematics is a very carefully constructed theory, with an incredibly elaborate and intricate system of definitions, with this just being a rough guide to the basics. If you all are interested, I could always do a series examining it in more detail. However, to return to the video at hand, it's time to talk about commutation, one of the most important functions there are when it comes to glossematic procedure. It refers to a correlation on one plane, linked by relation to correlation on another plane. In other words, commutation occurs when alternating something on the expression plane is syntagmatically linked to an alternation on the content plane, or vice versa. As an example, let's construct a category of graphic expression elements that begin syllables. Within this category, we will focus on the letters C and H. These letters correlate and alternate inside a paradigm, hence the 3 dots. As you can see on the other side, we find something similar with the content elements of cat and hat, which also correlate themselves. Between these two sets, there's relation, hence the uppercase R, which we can say, for simplicity's sake, acts as the sign function. when you change something of a plane of expression, something changes in content. If this example recalls our earlier discussion of invariance, that's because commutation defines the functives of C and H as such, with substitution being the function's opposite. Now, I would like to explore another phenomenon that's linked to both, syncretism. With this, we find the commutation between usually invariant elements to be suspended, making it possible to have a change in expression not cause a likewise change in content, or vice versa. To illustrate this, take the sounds p and b. Normally, these contract commutation. When expressed at the beginning of a word, for example, they cause a change in content. Pan and ban aren't the same signs after all. However, the same thing doesn't hold when it comes to p and b after a s sound. Span and span differ in expression, but the content remains the same. As you can see in this diagram, the relationship between p and b in this instance is called an overlapping, forming a category called a syncretism. Much the same thing can be found on the plane of content. The elements singular and plural generally contract commutation, like is the case of the words is and are, or glosseme and glossemes. However, in the second person, this is suspended and syncretism is formed. There is no change in expression in you versus you, even though one is plural and the other isn't. In both cases of expression and content, the members that overlap aren't considered to be invariants themselves. Instead, the syncretism as a whole plays that role. With this, we get to one of the final concepts we'll have to go through before looking at glossematic procedure itself, catalysis. At the beginning, we looked at the phrase, when he saw me, he left the garden, and said that the second clause determines or selects the first. However, it is possible for a content like when he saw me to appear in isolation. To maintain the selection, we have to interpolate something, a variant that can be replaced by essentially anything. Here, we catalyze the phrase by adding the content of noun, verb, tense, and so on. These are purely elements of content, having an expression that is equal to 0. It's for this reason that encapitalized elements don't contract commutation, and thus are not invariants. As you can see in this diagram, we can do the exact same thing with expression. In the beginning we had a clause with rising intonation, select another with falling intonation. To give another example, albeit with the same parameters, we might find the warning "you just try that one more time," all by itself. Although not exactly present, we can mark the implied clause with falling intonation with a line, with slashes representing how my voice moves. As shown below, there is no extra content included, just expression. With all this background, it's time to start exploring glossematic procedure itself. Fundamentally, it is organized around what Hjelmslev calls the empirical principle. To quote directly from the Résumé, description shall be free of contradiction, exhaustive, and as simple as possible. From this, we get the simplicity principle, which dictates that the simplest of two exhaustive non-contradictory descriptions is correct. There is also the principle of reduction, stating that each operation that makes up a description must be continued or repeated until it is exhausted. Together with another two principles, those of economy and generalization, these guide the procedure. However, so far, I have neglected to explain what exactly the focus of all this is. Essentially, as said at the very beginning, language is a structure. This means that it is a network of functions, composed of things like interdependencies, determinations, and constellations. Description is first and foremost the registering of such functions, which, in order to be exhaustive, starts from the broadest possible parts and goes deductively from there. In this video, given how long it already is, we will only look at the preliminary part of deduction. This is described as line analysis, and is split into three main sets of operations, marked with an asterisk and an uppercase G. As some context, a line is simply a syntagmatic plane. In the first phase of this analysis, G1, there's only a single operation, consisting of splitting the text being examined into a line of content and a line of expression. Nothing more, nothing less. Where things get complicated is with the next one. Here, on the basis of now split lines, you can choose whether G2 proceeds through selection or solidarity. Whichever one you pick, G3 will be the other. In the diagram taken from a dissertation, solidarity has been chosen for G2. The procedure continues as long as you keep finding solidarities, with both lines being divided simultaneously, even if they are separated. The first step of each operation, regardless of whether it belongs to G2 or G3, is to set up what Hjelmslev calls functional categories, on the basis of the function chosen. It's a kind of bound analysis, meaning that it has nothing to do with the description of languages. Rather, it sets up the basis for description itself, belonging wholly to theory. As you can see here, these functional categories are thus marked with Greek letters, placed within curly brackets next to the paradigm symbol. These variables mean different things depending on whether the current procedure is based on solidarity or selection. In the first case, lowercase beta marks solidary units, uppercase b marks combined ones, lowercase gamma is for units solidary in some cases and combined in others, and uppercase gamma signifies that they are neither solidary nor combined at all. The same pattern holds for selection, just with lowercase beta being selected and uppercase beta being selecting. Once you have set up these functional categories, it's time to start analyzing them into elements. Canger asks us to imagine a case where the end of G3 leaves us with syllables structured as consonant vowel and vowel, or CV and V. In this case, where G3 is based on selection, only two functional categories are realized, the selected lowercase beta and the selecting uppercase beta, corresponding to vowels and consonants respectively. Since neither of the gamma categories can be analyzed further, we call them virtual. This diagram shows the analysis of the two beta categories, with the doubled pair of dots symbolizing analyzed into. Getting out of bound analysis, we arrive at its free counterpart. This is characterized by establishing correlations between the elements of a functional category. Rather than being about presuppositions, the focus here is on oppositions and their suppression. The words wide and narrow, for example, oppose each other. From one point of view, they are exclusive. Something can't be wide and narrow at the same time, after all. However, under certain circumstances, this can be suppressed and described as a participation instead. When someone says how wide is the board, they aren't excluding the possibility of it being narrow. In Glossematics, the field of opposition can be represented by this first box, split across narrow and wide. With the second set of boxes, something changes. Here, we can see that the box marked narrow is linked to the field narrow alone, symbolized with a slash. However, for the box marked wide, both fields are included. In the clause from earlier, narrow acts as a variant of wide, but the same thing would be possible if the question was how narrow is the board. Adding some more terms to the pile, wide is considered to be the more extensive of the pair, as it extends over the so-called intensive narrow. Additionally, the terms above the boxes from before are described as participants. It's also not really appropriate to describe the fields as narrow and wide themselves. Glossematics, at least as Hjelmslev envisaged it, is first and foremost a kind of linguistic calculus. By naming the fields like that, we focus too much on the substance of it, not relationships themselves. Something all the more important to keep in mind, given the fact that variants lurk everywhere. These are general frames that are used to express mutual relationships between any categories imaginable. Usually, as represented here, the fields are simply described as A, B, and C. Just for the sake of convenience, we can say that, in this instance, A corresponds to small, B to size, and C to big. The fully crossed out fields are those that are insisted on by the participant marked above them, which means that all the term's immediate members include it. If we define A as corresponding to small, the term of the same name naturally insists on it. Nevertheless, even this isn't enough abstraction. We still have big, small, and size as participants. If we truly want to escape substance, we have to replace the categories themselves. In glossematic notation, this takes the form of lowercase Greek letters for intensive terms and uppercase ones for extensive ones, like we discussed earlier. With all this in mind, we get the following diagram. Here, we see that the participant symbolized by an uppercase gamma insists on C. As such, it can contain elements like AC, BC, and C, but not AB. Amongst the categories themselves, you also find functions, like contradictory and contrary correlation. In the case of the first, one participant is everything that the other isn't. This is the case for lowercase and uppercase gamma, where the former insists on A and C, whilst the latter only insists on B. In the case of the second, it's a bit stranger. Contrary correlation means that neither category has the same terms, nor another that isn't there for either. Lowercase and uppercase beta insist on A and B respectively, but neither does on C. Moving away from substance-based examples like those of big, small, wide, and narrow, overlapping offers a great view into the free analysis of forms themselves. Almost always, the function is contracted by one intensive participant and one extensive participant. It is only when the syncretism includes 3 or more functives that this changes. However, that's a bit outside of the scope for our video. For now, I would like to give an example of a first, second, and third person. As can be seen here, an overlapping is contracted by the first and second in all verbs except be. In that case, 2 things can happen. In the past tense, there's a syncretism between I was and he was. In the present tense, there's no such syncretism to be found. From these, we can say that the first person is extensive, whilst the second and third are intensive. They have a much smaller range in comparison. We thus end up with a situation like the one presented in the bottom box. Having now looked at both bound and free analysis, it's time to explore some of the units that define glossematics as a linguistic theory, and to examine how exactly it can be applied to actual languages. Basically, the 3 pre-line analyses we looked at earlier function as a kind of theoretical framework that stays the same for all descriptions, but which can have different semiotics fitted into it. For example, only 2 of the 4 functional categories were realized in our example of syllables from earlier. Other languages might have 3, or even only 1. Moreover, despite my phrasing, the analyses don't actually register things like syllables, morphemes, or phonemes. Instead, we only get elements defined by their associated functions and operations. When it comes to these units, we can start with lexias and their parts, called lexemes. The former are formally defined in the Résumé as the highest degree elements, each of which can alone constitute a catalyzed unit of the next lowest degree. I think Canger demonstrates what this means best. A single chapter can constitute a book. A single paragraph can constitute a chapter. A single sentence can constitute a paragraph. So far, so good. Things only change beyond this level, with clauses. Without catalysis, something like "when he saw me" just doesn't constitute anything. It's in this way that lexias are roughly analogous to sentences and clauses to lexemes. To end this video, I would like to talk about another set of units, taxemes and glossemes. Starting with the former, these are formally defined as the visual elements yielded at the end of an analysis based on selection. What this means is that they are what cannot be broken down further through this operation. The goal of G3 is ultimately to get us to this point, which then gets developed in another stage known as taxematics, which we don't have time for today. For now, I hope that it is enough to say that expression taxemes, at least when it comes to those manifested in spoken substance, are roughly equivalent to phonemes. The reason why I mention this is that the goal of glossematics, like the name suggests, is to find glossemes and thus exhaust the analysis completely. These are the smallest possible invariant elements found on either plane, known as senemes when it comes to expression, and pleremes when it comes to content. If phonemes manifest taxemes, senemes are manifested by parts of phonemes. As shown in this diagram, you can find glossemes by setting up a category that contains the manifestations of taxemes as the products of a pair of dimensions. Glossemes, in this case, are found with the sum of the dimensions. So whilst there are 6 taxeme manifestations, there are 5 categories of glossemes, irreducible invariants being the members of the alphas, the betas, and the gamma that are multiplied together. It's with this that I'd like to conclude, having now explored some of the many nooks and crannies of Hjelmslev's Glossematics. I know this has been quite a long and dense video, but I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll most likely be looking at another Glossematics adjacent work, Quatres, Hjelmslev and Immanence. Until then, bye!